Chapters 3 through 12 is the application of the Optimal Ethics Systems Model. So first let me tell you a little bit of background to the model itself and how it came about. A couple of years ago, John Wiley & Sons had asked me, if I was a CEO of an organization, what would I do in order to maximize ethical behavior in the organization? And as a result of that, I came up with the Optimal Ethics Systems Model. And that's what we'll be playing around with from now until Chapter 12, beginning with Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is about hiring ethical people. If you hire ethical people, most of the other ethics systems will go through very, very smoothly. But if you hire people who are unethical, that can sabotage everything else that appears in the rest of the book. So Chapter 3 is extremely essential to make sure you do what the benchmarks recommend you do in terms of hiring ethical people. So in Chapter 3, there will be 7 items in the benchmark, and I'm going to take you through each of the 7 items and talk a little bit about them, with the hope that you will implement all 7 of them, or see which of these 7 you've already done and which ones you still need to work on. Let's assume you have 2 job finalists for an opening in your organization. Both of them are highly qualified to perform the task. Now the challenge is, which one of those 2 is more ethical? That may sound like a hard question to answer, but there are little techniques you can do to get at the ethics of the job candidates within a very short time during the job interview process. So we'll begin first with item number 1. Benchmark number 1 is the importance of ethics is highlighted in your job listings. So anytime you advertise for a job, you should have a little sentence put in there that says, this organization used an ethics job screen when employing people. Think about the impact of that on the person reading it. If you're an ethical person, you're amazed by that because you don't see that in very many places. As a result, you think this organization is really concerned about ethics, and it's a place that I would want to work for. Now think if you're an unethical person and you see that posted somewhere. You won't even apply for the job because you see how serious the organization takes ethics. So if you're the kind of person who might cheat the organization, who might steal some product, who might be abusive, you'll say, I won't even apply for the job there because I won't have a chance of getting hired. So that does a nice pre-screen for you, and it attracts ethical people to the organization, and it takes away unethical people from even deciding to apply for the job. Benchmark number 2. Information is gathered and used in a way that does not discriminate based on a person's race, color, religion, gender, national origin, age, or disability. That long list of items I just read comes from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII. The reason that exists is because prior to 1964, it was legally permissible to not hire somebody because they were a woman, or because they were Italians and you don't like Italians, or because they were African Americans. In 1964, the federal government said that is not the way that a just society operates. A just society is not biased toward those particular aspects of our character and of our human makeup. So what we need to do from the very get-go is to make sure that our job applicant pool has a nice diversity of job candidates. That may sound easier to do than what it really is, because in most organizations, what is the best source of job applicants for a job? Now, when you think about that, the easiest way to get job applicants is just to ask current employees of the organization who they would recommend. Your current employees, of course, will recommend good people because these are people that they'll be working with every day. And plus, if the job candidate that they recommend doesn't do a good job or is unethical, it damages their own reputation in the organization. So typically, employees will recommend friends who are well qualified and very, very ethical. But now imagine you're working for an organization that is managed by mostly white males, and you ask the employees to recommend people for the job. Sociologically, white males tend to hang out with white males. Males tend to hang out with males, females with females. Caucasians with Caucasians, African Americans tend to hang out with African Americans, and Asians tend to hang out with Asians. So if you ask a bunch of white men to recommend people for a job, there's a high likelihood they're going to recommend a white male, which is great because the person might be highly qualified. The downside, though, is that you're opening yourself up to a federal lawsuit due to discrimination. The way that the federal government looks at this is it assumes that the organization's profile of employees should be similar to the profile for that geographic region based upon education requirements and job skills requirements. So let's say if you're hiring somebody for a marketing opening, and let's say you live in a community that's 80% Caucasian and 20% African American, and they're all equally qualified for the job. People have the same ratio has, say, master's degree in marketing and similar job-related experiences. If you're unbiased, you would assume that 80% of your marketing employees will be Caucasian and 20% of them will be African American, which is a position that judges begin off with when they look at cases like this. Now, let's say you have 100% Caucasians working in your marketing department. That's possible, but the judge will ask you, why is that the case? Since there are 20% of the people in your area are African American that are highly qualified for the job. And you can say, well, what happens is that other organizations pay better than our organization, and therefore African Americans drift toward those higher paying jobs. And the judge would say that makes sense. So the law case is dismissed. But if that isn't the case, you're opening yourself up to huge legal fees due to discrimination because of Civil Rights Act Title VII violations. So you want to be really careful about that. And you want to pause when you look at your job applicant pool and make sure there's a nice diversity based upon gender, ethnicity, religion, and all the other characteristics that make communities so vibrant and so diverse. Benchmark item number 3. Reference checks are conducted with a potential employee's former employer or supervisor. Now, we've all applied for jobs, and you could think through, who do you usually put as your references on job applications? Of course, we put down the names of 3 or 4 people who are going to say great and wonderful things about us. Therefore, is it a waste of time to look at references? No, it's still worthwhile looking at references on several variables. First, you really don't know in advance what people are going to say about you. I've called up references for people applying for jobs as a research assistant, and I'm shocked to hear people say that this person applying for the job was not a good worker. So just because the applicant thinks that somebody at their former place is going to say good things about them, that's not always the case, and it's worth finding that out. Another thing with reference checks is that sometimes when you call up, the person you're calling up will say, I can only give you name, rank, and serial number. Beyond that, the HR and the legal department says I shouldn't be talking about the candidate that's applying for a job in your organization. How do you get around that? Because you're missing out on important information. Basically, all you have to do is just ask that person, I understand the situation, and I'm going to ask you just one question. Would you rehire this person? If it turns out that person is an excellent employee, the person will always say, of course I am, but please don't ask me any more questions because my legal department doesn't want me to answer it. If it turns out the person applying for the job wasn't a good employee, the person will hesitate on the phone. And there'll be that pause, and there'll be a delay, and that is a red flag. That doesn't mean the person isn't qualified to perform the job, but it's just suggesting to you that there's some question about that person's previous job experience. So then when you interview that person for the job, I would ask the person, by the way, I called your references, and there was a little hesitancy in sharing information about you. Can you tell me about it? And hopefully the person will be able to explain why there was some hesitancy. Maybe it was because their former boss doesn't like them because the former boss was unethical. Or maybe because the former boss is still resentful because the person quit that job. So those are important things to consider. The other thing with references is you want to make sure that the person's previous boss or supervisor is among the references. If the previous supervisor isn't there, that's a red flag item. Why isn't the previous boss listed as someone that would be worthy of you having a discussion with? So you want to ask that of the job candidate when you look at their references. By the way, I've noticed that you don't have any previous supervisors amongst your references. Why is that? And once again, there might be a good reason for that. Or maybe the person didn't even think about that. So either case, I would tell the person, can you please give me the name of a previous boss so that I can talk to them about you? Also, if you're hiring a manager, it's a good strategy to ask the person, I want to interview one of your previous subordinates. And once again, if the person is an excellent manager at the previous job, they can give you a list of 10 subordinates that will say nice things about them. But if they weren't a good manager, they might hesitate in providing the name of a subordinate, which once again is a red flag. So that's something that's worth pursuing. Benchmark number 4. Background checks, integrity tests, and personality tests are conducted with potential employees. Now, background checks are essential, and they're pretty easy to do now by just Googling a search on the person's name. But you can also outsource with a background check firm. What are the kinds of things you're looking for in a background check? There's been a lot of studies done on resumes, and unfortunately, what's been found is that people will exaggerate their previous job task as well as their educational background experiences on their resumes. We tend to want to make ourselves to look better than what we usually are when we're applying for a job. So that's worth looking at, making sure that they really did graduate from the school that they said they graduated from, and that they really did take those courses that they said that they took. And you also want to make sure that they really did perform those job tasks that they said that they performed, which can once again verify through your reference checks. Personality tests are fun things to do because it tells you something about the person's psychological makeup. Personality tests you might want to consider is the best one is on pro-social behaviors and organizational citizenship. It turns out that people that score high on organization citizenship are very pro-social and are very conscientious, plus they're very, very hard workers. So that's an easy scale to do, and that scale is available on the internet or through a source that's available in the textbook. Integrity tests are questionable in giving. Many organizations do integrity tests, but you have to wonder about how valid they are. The answers to integrity test questions are usually pretty obvious. Have you ever stolen? Now, if asked that question, if you're a conscientious person, have I ever stolen? I might think, well, when I was a teenager, I stole some stuff. And it didn't ask me about if I was a teenager or not. So I might not give myself the highest score. And therefore, I might give myself on a 1 to 5 scale, maybe a 4, because I know I'm very sensitive to the fact that as a teenager, I hung out with this gang and we did some odd stuff that I now regret now that I'm an older, wiser person. But if you ask that question and if I'm a liar and if I'm a thief, I know you want the answer number 5 that says I've never stolen. So therefore, I'm going to give you the answer you want. And as a result, a lot of studies have shown that people who are thieves and liars score higher on integrity tests than honest people. So it's still worth giving, but you want to be careful about interpreting the results of integrity tests. Benchmark item number 5. Job finalists are asked to respond orally to potential ethical dilemmas. As we mentioned in Chapter 1, we face ethical dilemmas at work every day. If you're into marketing, you have marketing ethical dilemmas. If you're an accountant, you have accounting ethical dilemmas. If you do risk management, there are plenty of risk management ethical dilemmas. So if I'm hiring somebody for a marketing position, I will share with that person, here's an ethical dilemma that we face in our organization. In our organization, every now and then, we're contacted by somebody who's willing to send us data that is of a questionable value, that the person did not, that the people, the customers, potential customers, did not offer that in goodwill. So somehow that data was collected in a very questionable manner. Do you accept that database from that organization? And you just ask that person, what would you do in a situation like this? Another kind of question to ask people is just to ask them in general, some ethical issue that might be relevant to you, say sexual harassment. You can ask the person, how have you responded at your previous organization when you observed sexual harassment? Hopefully the situation is the person never observed sexual harassment. But there is a preponderance of sexual harassment in society, and you can assume that, yes, they probably observed it sometime in their life, sexual harassment at work. In that case, hopefully the person says, when I observed sexual harassment, I stepped forward and I told the guy that was doing the sexual harassment, don't ever do that again. That's not appropriate, that's disrespectful, and it might open us up to a lawsuit. If instead the person says, I saw it happen, but I didn't do anything about it because I didn't want to be a squealer, or I didn't want to get the person into trouble. Those are red flag answers, and it tells you something about the ethics of the job candidate. Benchmark item number 6. Managers take into consideration a potential employee's ethics when making a final hiring decision. It's great to advertise you do an ethics job screen. It's great to talk about ethics during the job interview. But when you get down to the final decision, make sure that you do take into consideration their responses to the ethical issues that were raised during the job interview process. Too often, managers just want to hire the best qualified person in terms of competency. But if you hire somebody who is highly competent yet unethical, they can destroy the organizational culture and they can destroy the organization through lawsuits and bankruptcy later on. So you want to be clear that when you're actually making the final decision, that you do take into consideration ethics in the process. Once again, the person you're hiring, you want that person to be efficient as well as being ethical. You want them to be talented as well as being ethical. If you hire just a bunch of ethical people and they're not talented, you're going to go bankrupt. And if you hire a bunch of talented people and they're unethical, you're going to go bankrupt. So you want to make sure you have both talent and ethics when you're making your final hiring decision. In this chapter, the last benchmark is number 7. When appropriate, alcohol, drug, and polygraph tests are conducted. There are plenty of jobs and plenty of organizations that are where the public is at risk due to the activities that take place. So let's say I'm hiring somebody to drive the corporate van from the headquarters to the airport. It's reasonable, given that, to look into the person's alcohol intake in their life, and then also to give them an alcohol test and to see how they perform. So that's reasonable because that particular issue, alcoholism, will impact their job test because they're going to be on the road. Do they have any DWIs on their record? That's important to consider. Same way with drug testing. If the person is using heavy equipment, you want to make sure that the person passes a drug test. The chapter goes through various kinds of drug tests you can give potential job candidates. Once again, let's say if you're working in a nuclear power facility, you would give the person a polygraph test because at those facilities there's top secret information. So there are particular jobs where these kinds of screens are essential that you do. You want to make sure that if you give any of these tests, the test you're given is job related, that you're testing them for drugs or alcohol on a job task where alcoholism and drug use would matter. Not in a situation where alcohol use and drug use wouldn't really matter in terms of the job if it's done on a recreational basis outside of work. So if you put in those 7 benchmarks, and if you do well on all of them, you will have a job screening process that will result in the hiring of very, very ethical people who are highly talented to perform the tasks.